Science has given us amazing discoveries, but sometimes it takes a dark and terrifying turn. Throughout history, some experiments pushed the limits of ethics, morality, and even humanity itself. Scientists have tested bizarre theories on people and animals, sometimes with horrifying consequences. Some of these experiments were so disturbing that they were banned forever. But what were they trying to prove? And why did they cross the line? Today, we're uncovering the most shocking banned science experiments that went too far. Stay tuned, because some of these will send chills down your spine. Monkey gland madness. Back in 1920, something totally crazy happened. A doctor actually transplanted monkey glands into a human. Sounds wild, right? Well, Dr. Serge Voronoff truly believed that monkey testicles were the secret to making humans live forever. Yep, he thought that adding a little monkey magic could make people stronger, younger, and basically invincible. And he wasn't alone. Another scientist, Charles Edouard Brown-Séquard, had already been injecting mashed-up animal glands into himself, hoping for superhuman results. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But instead of giving up, Voronoff decided to take things even further. So, in 1920, he went all in. He actually sewed a piece of monkey testicle onto a man's body, right onto his scrotum. Voronoff claimed this would restore youthful energy, cure diseases, and even fix mental illnesses like schizophrenia. People were desperate for a fountain of youth, so some actually believed him. But surprise, surprise, it didn't turn anyone into a superhuman. Instead, history just remembers it as one of the most bizarre and questionable medical experiments ever attempted. The Stanford Prison Experiment. If you give some people power over others, their behavior changes, sometimes in shocking ways. Back in 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to see what happens when people are put in roles of prisoners and guards. He turned the basement of Stanford University's psychology building into a fake prison and chose 24 students for the experiment. Half played prisoners, stuck inside 24/7, while the other half became guards, working in shifts and going home at night. The study was supposed to last 2 weeks, with hidden cameras and microphones recording everything. But things got out of control way too fast. Within days, the guards turned cruel and the prisoners became depressed and anxious. It got so bad that the whole experiment was shut down after just 6 days. The big question is, why does power change people so much? And why do uniforms and authority make some people act in ways they normally wouldn't? This experiment was a disaster in many ways, and it would never be allowed today, but it left us with more questions than answers about human behavior. The monster speech experiment. Being an orphan during the Great Depression was already heartbreaking, but things got even worse when a woman named Mary Tudor Jacobs came along. She was a retired speech therapist, and she decided to use 22 children from the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans Home in Davenport for a cruel experiment. She split them into 2 groups. One received positive speech therapy, while the other was pressured into stuttering. These kids spoke just fine before, but she used harsh techniques to make some of them develop a permanent stutter. The goal was to prove that stuttering wasn't something people were born with, but something they learned from parents correcting their speech. But in doing so, she destroyed the confidence and voices of innocent children who had no way to fight back. At least 8 of them were left with lifelong speech problems. Mary Tudor Jacobs may have smiled while doing it, but she earned the name the Monster for the pain she caused. And the worst part? Her cruel experiment worked exactly as planned. Hurricane King experiment gone wrong. In 1947, a group of scientists thought they could control a hurricane. What could possibly go wrong? They called it Project Cirrus, an experiment to weaken storms by dumping crushed dry ice into them. The plan? Fly bomber planes straight into a hurricane and drop loads of ice, hoping it would make the storm less powerful. The team, led by GE Labs, waited for the perfect storm. When Hurricane King moved over Florida and headed out to sea, they saw their chance. A group of military planes took off from Alabama, flew into the storm, dumped their icy cargo, and went home, waiting to see what happened next. Well, the next day the storm was gone, but not in a good way. Instead of weakening, Hurricane King had changed direction, and it was getting stronger. It slammed into Savannah, Georgia, then tore through South Carolina, causing massive damage and even killing one person. People were furious, blaming the scientists for making things worse. GE was hit with lawsuits, but in the end, experts decided the storm had probably changed course on its own before the ice was even dropped. Still, Project Cirrus was a disaster, and weather modification never looked the same again. The Radium Girls' tragedy. They thought they had the perfect job, but it was secretly killing them. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, young women in the US worked in factories painting watch dials with glowing radium paint. Their bosses told them the paint was harmless, but that was a deadly lie. They were even forced to put the paintbrushes in their mouths to keep the tips sharp, swallowing poison every day. With no protection, their bodies absorbed the radium, leading to horrifying illnesses. But when they started getting sick, the company didn't help. They tried to destroy their reputations instead. The women were accused of having STDs like syphilis to cover up the truth. Experts had warned that the paint was dangerous, but factory owners ignored them to keep making money. Some women in New Jersey got compensation, but many got nothing. By the 1930s, most were dead. Their fight did lead to new worker protection laws, but for them, justice came far too late. The dark secret of the Tuskegee study. Back in 1932, syphilis had no cure, and it was a terrifying disease. It caused painful sores, blindness, madness, and eventually death. The U.S. Public Health Service, PHS, decided to study how the disease progressed, but in the worst way possible. They recruited 600 poor African-American men from Alabama, promising free medical care. But instead of helping them, doctors secretly infected 399 of them with syphilis and refused to give them real treatment. They lied, calling it bad blood, and only gave them useless drugs like aspirin, even after penicillin became the actual cure in 1947. The men suffered for years, going blind, losing their minds, and dying slow, painful deaths. But the horror didn't stop with them. The disease spread to at least 40 spouses and 19 children. The study went on for decades before it was finally exposed. By then, most victims had died, but the few who survived, along with their families, eventually got a settlement. The Tuskegee syphilis study remains one of the worst medical scandals in history. Chernobyl's ghost zone. In 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear reactor exploded, causing one of the worst disasters in history. Deadly radiation spread across a massive area, forcing people to flee their homes. To keep people safe, officials created the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, a no-go area stretching 30 kilometers around the ruined plant. Over time, the zone expanded, now covering around 1,000 square miles of Ukraine. This place remains one of the most radioactive spots on Earth, with strict limits on who can enter. Different parts of the zone have different rules, managed by various authorities. Some areas remain highly dangerous, while others are slowly becoming safer. As radiation levels drop, officials are considering changing the boundaries, but Chernobyl will remain unlivable for thousands of years. The land may heal over time, but for now, it's a ghost town, frozen in the past. The Challenger tragedy. The world watched in excitement on January 28, 1986, as the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Cape Canaveral, Florida. This mission was special because, for the first time, a civilian, a schoolteacher named Krista McAuliffe, was going to space. Millions, including school children everywhere, were glued to their TVs. But just 73 seconds after takeoff, disaster struck. The shuttle broke apart in a massive explosion of smoke and fire, and heartbreakingly, no one on board survived. Investigators later discovered that a small rubber seal called an O-ring had failed in one of the rockets, setting off a chain reaction that led to the explosion. NASA was shaken and didn't send another shuttle into space for 2 years as they worked to improve safety. That tragic day left a deep mark on history, especially for those who saw it happen live on TV. The dream of space travel suddenly felt more dangerous than ever. Oil spill disaster, Deepwater Horizon. It was one of the worst environmental disasters in history. In April 2010, the Deepwater Horizon oil platform exploded in the Gulf of Mexico, causing the largest marine oil spill ever recorded. Owned by BP, the platform was drilling at the Macondo prospect off the coast of Louisiana when disaster struck. Around 4.9 million barrels of oil leaked into the ocean, spreading over months. Attempts to stop it failed, and even after they claimed to seal the well in September, reports in 2012 suggested it was still leaking. The damage was massive. By 2013, over 2,200 tons of oil had to be removed from Louisiana's beaches, and marine life suffered terribly. But the nightmare didn't end there. Dolphins were dying at alarming rates, and by 2014, scientists found fish and other sea creatures developing deadly deformities. The cause? BP's reckless cost-cutting decisions, which led to a catastrophic failure. In the explosion, 11 workers lost their lives and 17 more were injured. The long-term effects on the environment, wildlife, and even people living along the coast are still being felt today. BP was fined billions for their negligence, but they moved on, while nature and communities continue to pay the price. Deadly anthrax leak. Back in 1979, a huge mistake turned into a disaster. Some clueless workers at a Soviet military base accidentally released deadly anthrax spores into the air over Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg, Russia. Yes, anthrax, the stuff that can kill people fast. Once it spread, there was no stopping it. At least 68 people died, but some believe the real number was much higher. The Soviet government? They acted like nothing happened. Instead of admitting the truth, they blamed the deaths on bad meat sold by butchers. But the world wasn't fooled. The West saw this as proof that the Soviet Union was secretly developing biological weapons, and they were doing it on a massive scale. Bikini Atoll. The United States turned Bikini Atoll into a nuclear testing ground, forcing 167 islanders to leave their homes in 1946. During the Cold War, from 1946 to 1958, the US detonated powerful nuclear bombs in the area, leaving behind devastating destruction. The islanders were relocated to a nearby island that couldn't even support them properly. For over a decade, the once beautiful atoll became a testing site for deadly weapons, poisoning the land and water. In 1970, some residents returned, hoping to rebuild their lives. But by 1978, tests revealed dangerously high radiation levels in their bodies and even in their drinking water. The island was still toxic. Even today, the effects remain. Sharks avoid the waters, fruits from the trees are unsafe to eat, and despite being open to tourism, it's still a radioactive danger zone. In 1980, the islanders were forced to leave once again, leaving behind a home they could never truly return to. Castle Bravo, they thought they had it all figured out. On March 1, 1954, the US conducted its first high-yield thermonuclear test at Bikini Atoll, called Castle Bravo. But there was one big problem. They weren't completely sure how the lithium-based bomb would react. And guess what? It went horribly wrong. The explosion was way bigger than expected, 2.5 times more powerful than predicted. And when you're dealing with nuclear bombs, that kind of miscalculation is a disaster waiting to happen. The blast sent radioactive material flying across a massive area, contaminating everything in its path. People living nearby were exposed to dangerous radiation, and the long-term effects were devastating. This wasn't just a failed test, it was one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. And to this day, Castle Bravo remains the most powerful nuclear test ever conducted by the US. Deadly experiment over San Francisco. In 1950, the US Navy did something shocking. They sprayed bacteria over San Francisco without telling anyone. They wanted to see how easily a biological attack could spread, so between September 20th and 27th, they released bacteria from a ship in the bay. The Army then checked 43 locations around the city and found that nearly all 800,000 residents had been exposed to tiny particles, enough to infect people if it had been anthrax. The results were terrifying. By mid-October, 11 people were hospitalized with rare and dangerous infections. While 10 of them recovered, one man wasn't so lucky. The infection reached his heart and killed him. What was meant to be a test ended up being a real-life disaster, proving just how dangerous biological weapons could be. Vipahome experiment, sugar that destroyed teeth. Can you believe that scientists once fed mentally disabled children loads of sticky candy just to see how fast their teeth would rot? This happened in Sweden in the late 1940s at the Vipahome Mental Institution. The researchers wanted to study tooth decay, but their methods were shocking. At first, they studied the children's teeth and found they were actually healthier than most people's. For 2 years, they gave them a diet with little starch, half the usual sugar and vitamins like A, C, D, and fluoride. By the end, 78% of the children had no new cavities. But then, things took a dark turn. The scientists started giving the children twice the normal amount of sugar in different forms. One group got extra sticky toffee that clung to their teeth. The result? Their teeth were destroyed, leaving many in constant pain. And the worst part? The researchers didn't even bother to fix the damage they caused. It was a cruel experiment, all in the name of science. Scared for life, the little Albert experiment. Back in the day, some experiments were just plain cruel, and this one is a perfect example. In 1920, researchers wanted to study how fear works in humans, but instead of just observing, they decided to create fear in a baby. They took a little boy, known as Little Albert, and exposed him to things like masks, furry animals, and other harmless objects. But here's the twisted part. They paired these with loud, terrifying noises to make him scared. The result? They basically trained him to be afraid of things he was never scared of before. Over time, he developed deep phobias, all because the researchers wanted to see if they could condition fear. No one seemed to care about what this would do to the child in the long run. This was not just unethical, it was downright cruel. Chimp raised as a human. Would a chimp act like a human if raised as one? In 1931, psychologist Winthrop Kellogg wanted to find out. He brought home a baby chimpanzee named Gua and raised her alongside his own son, Donald. The goal? To see if a chimp could learn human behavior or even believe it was human. Sounds crazy, right? For 9 months, Kellogg ran tests on both children, checking their memory, reflexes, and language skills. At first, Gua seemed to be learning faster than Donald. She even hit milestones just like him. But then, nature took over. No matter how much she adapted, she was still a chimpanzee. Then the experiment suddenly ended. Why? Some think the Kelloggs got scared. Maybe Gua was getting too strong, or maybe Donald was picking up chimp-like behaviors. Either way, they sent Gua to a primate colony, where she returned to her natural life. A wild experiment, but one that proves no matter how much we try, a chimp will always be a chimp. War fleas. Dropping fleas from the sky as weapons? Yes, that actually happened. The US military once ran a secret test called Operation Big Itch to see if fleas could spread biological weapons. These weren't just any fleas. They were packed into tiny bombs that would break apart in the air, releasing thousands of them over a huge area. But here's the twist. These fleas weren't carrying diseases. The whole experiment was just to see how well they could survive and spread if they ever were used in real warfare. Just imagine walking through a battlefield filled with biting fleas. The idea was terrifying, even without any diseases involved. The fleas were dropped in small parachute bomblets, spreading them far and wide. It was all part of a chilling study on how insects could be turned into deadly weapons. This wasn't just a wild idea. Many nations have experimented with insect warfare, proving that even the tiniest creatures can be a real nightmare in battle. Nuclear explosions for construction. The US once had a wild idea, using nuclear bombs for construction. In 1957, they launched Project Plowshare, a program to prove that nuclear explosions weren't just for war. Instead, they wanted to use them for digging through rock, making chemicals, and even exploring deep underground. This was part of a bigger plan called Atoms for Peace, which tried to show that nuclear power wasn't just about destruction, it could be useful too. But here's the problem: radiation. Blowing up nukes for construction meant dangerous radioactive fallout, which could end up in drinking water and the air. So, while the idea sounded promising, the risks were just too high. Turns out, nukes and public health don't mix well. MK-Ultra, the CIA's secret mind control experiment. The CIA once ran a secret project called MK-Ultra, and when the truth came out in 1975, people were shocked. From 1953 to 1973, they tested LSD and other drugs to see if they could control minds for spying and even psychological torture. They carried out hundreds of secret experiments, sometimes without the test subjects even knowing. More than 150 people were exposed to mind-altering drugs, electric shocks, and other extreme methods to see if brainwashing was possible. In the end, LSD proved too unpredictable for intelligence work, but the damage was already done. The experiments were not only unethical, but also caused serious harm to many people. The truth about MKUltra only came to light when a congressional investigation exposed the CIA's illegal activities in the US and beyond. The vanishing warship. Did you know there's a story about a warship that supposedly disappeared into thin air? Back in 1943, a man named Carl M. Allen claimed he saw the US Navy conduct a wild experiment at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. According to him, they tried to make a ship, the USS Eldridge, completely invisible. Not only did it vanish, but Allen said it teleported all the way to Norfolk, Virginia, before popping back in Philadelphia minutes later. Sounds crazy, right? Most people think it's just a hoax, but somehow, we're still talking about it today. Now here's where it gets even weirder. Allen said the crew on board suffered horrifying side effects. Some lost their minds, others got stuck in solid objects, and some even became invisible themselves, unable to move or interact with the world. It sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie. But was it real, or just a tall tale? That's the mystery. Science can be fascinating, but these experiments prove that curiosity can sometimes go too far. Which of these shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more mind-blowing stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon.